Hello and welcome to my instructional video. This is Sumner Smith. I've been the artist and designer at Spotted Dog Farm making resin jewelry for years now. And you can see the full range of my resin jewelry at spotteddogfarm.com. This is a video showing you my best tips and tricks on how to make resin jewelry at home. I use a few different techniques now that I'm in sort of full production. I pressurize my jewelry while it cures. I make all of my own molds, but this is how I started and I got very good results with it. So I'm going to give you my best at-home tips and tricks on how to make this successful. A couple things to note here. This specifically uses components from my kit that I sell, and so if you have one of the kits, you'll have exactly what I'm using here, but this will work for any resin jewelry. And if you want to buy just a few pieces, if you want a mold, if you want some flowers, you can go to my website, spotteddogfarm.com, under the DIY section, and you'll find all that. Another note, read the instructions on your resin really carefully and make sure you follow all of the safety recommendations. I personally use a full mask, eye protection, and goggles every time I do anything with resin. It's just important. Just take care of yourself, really. It's unlikely to cause a problem the first time you do anything, but I just figure why risk it? It's time to get started, and before you do, just a couple of quick notes. For one thing, you're definitely going to get the best results if you keep the temperature of both your working environment and the resin itself right at or around 72 degrees. And also, humidity below 50% will give you the best results. One more thing, you're going to notice that I'm showing you my real live work table. It is kind of a mess, and I'm showing you my real process on purpose so that you'll know to cover your workspace with cardboard or maybe a plastic sheet. And also, don't wear clothes that you don't want to get resin on, because it's somewhat likely to happen. Okay, let's get started. Okay, the very first thing you want to do is check out your mold and make sure it looks pretty clean, no dust, no other debris. Then you're going to take the flowers and just place them wherever you want in the mold. You can have some fun with this. You can use any flowers that you've pressed or dried in any combination you want. So go ahead and fill up your mold with the flowers. The next thing you're going to do is mix your resin, and you're going to do it according to whatever the resin instructions are. The easiest resin to mix, and the kind I've included in my kit, is an epoxy resin with a 1-to-1 mix ratio. That means you don't have to weigh it. All you have to do is measure equally part A and part B. You can get disposable measuring cups that are really fancy, but they're also super expensive, and since you can only use them once, and I should point that out, you can't reuse any kind of cups you've used to measure resin. You're never going to get the resin residue out of it. So with that being the case, I just tend to use cups that have equal markings, and then I just pour part A and part B to the exact same marking, each in their own separate cup, and then I pour them into a third cup to mix, and it's sort of a cheap and easy way to get disposable mixing cups for this purpose. So with that said, we're going to get started. I just have plain old small plastic cups with ridges. I'm going to take part A and part B, and I'm using giant bottles, but this is the same resin that's in my kit in smaller bottles. So I'm going to pour part A exactly to one of the ridges on the cup, whatever I decide. And then I'm very carefully going to pour part B to the same ridge on a separate cup. And I think I sped the video up here just so you didn't grow old while watching this, but let's just assume that I'm very carefully pouring the resin to the exact same place in both of these cups. And then I'm actually going to pour both of these into a third cup. And the reason you're doing this instead of just combining them is because resin is super finicky. And if you just combined them, then whichever one was originally in the cup you combined to would have more resin in the mix, because whatever was clinging to the sides of the cup would still be in there from where you combine the two. So you're going to pour them both into a third cup to ensure that they sort of got equal treatment, the part A and the part B. And then you're going to follow the instructions of your resin, but most of them require you to mix them twice very thoroughly. So you're going to scrape the sides, scrape the cup that you're using, scrape the stir stick, You're going to stir super thoroughly until it looks pretty well mixed. And then you're actually going to pour it all into yet another cup. Scrape the sides, scrape the stir stick, and then stir this next cup with a brand new stir stick to make sure it's combined incredibly well. That's actually one of the most common places to end up with an issue with your resin, is that people don't end up actually stirring it well enough, and thus it's not really mixed properly, and that's how you end up with soft spots or spots that don't cure properly. One word here about how you're mixing it. I've sped this video up because it really takes a long time to mix. So it looks like I'm mixing crazy fast, but I'm definitely not. You want to do more of a folding technique, because if you whip it like crazy, you're going to end up with air bubbles in the resin, and those bubbles are going to end up being a problem for you once it's time to pour. So kind of mix gently, not like the sped up video. So despite my best efforts, as you can see, there definitely are some bubbles in the resin. So here's a little trick for you. You can pour the resin into little plastic cups, or these are actually paper Dixie cups, and let it rest for just a couple of minutes. And that way the bubbles can rise to the top before you pour. You really only want to let it rest for a couple of minutes, otherwise it'll start to cure in the cups. But you can let it rest for a couple of minutes. As long as the resin isn't getting warm in the cups, then you're good to go, and it'll release some of those bubbles before you start to pour. That's also the reason you're going to divide it into a few different cups to let it rest while the bubbles rise, because the more resin you have in one cup together, the faster it's going to start to cure. So you just kind of spread it out into these cups so that there's more surface area for the bubbles to rise, and also so that it doesn't start to cure as quickly. So now you're ready to pour the resin in the mold, and you're just going to very gently pour it in, taking care to try not to dislodge the flowers, but you can move them around in the resin if they do move. And you're just going to pour all the way to the top of the mold. You've got the resin in the mold, and now you wait for it to cure, whatever the resin instructions tell you, usually at least 24 hours. You've waited, now it's time. You're going to take your finished piece of jewelry and you're going to pop it out of the mold. You're using a silicone mold. Please use a silicone mold so it's much easier to get the resin out. And you're just going to pop it out of the mold. It's beautiful. It is going to have a raw edge from the top of the mold though. It's hard to see here, but that raw edge is right across the top. You're going to take your piece of sandpaper and sand that raw edge down. A note here, I've done this a ton, so I don't look like I'm being careful, but be careful, only sand the raw part, not the finished part. You have this raw edge that's been sanded now, but clearly, well, probably, you don't want to leave it like that with this sanded part on top. So you're going to mix one more set of resin, and I use these little bitty medical measuring cups to do it. They're super cheap. You can get them on Amazon, and there's a link to that on my website in the DIY section. In fact, there's a link to most everything I use here that you can buy on Amazon on my website on the DIY section. So you're just going to do the exact same thing where you mix part A, mix part B. Be even more careful with your measurements here, because when you're mixing tiny little amounts, if you get the ratio off, it ends up being big percentage-wise, and you'll end up with resin that doesn't cure properly. If you do end up messing up the ratio and the resin that you've painted on top doesn't cure, you can just sand that off and do it again. But again, I've sped up this video. I'm not stirring this quickly, but I am stirring very thoroughly. You're going to do the exact same thing where you stir twice super thoroughly. And once you have this resin finished, you're going to use, I use a little kid's, like a craft paintbrush with those really stiff nylon bristles. That's my favorite kind of paintbrush to use. You're going to have to throw it away when you're done, so there's definitely no point in using anything fancy. And one trick I have is I like to trim the bristles on these teeny tiny paintbrushes so they're really short, and then they're also, I trim about half of them off, so I'm only using about half of the bristles. It just makes it a lot easier to control where you're painting this resin. So then you kind of very delicately just paint a very thin layer of resin over the strip that you sanded. And this goes for any piece of jewelry you're making, by the way. No matter what you make, if you make it in a mold, you've got this same process where you've sanded off the raw edge and now you're just going to paint one more quick coat of resin over that sanded off edge. Do be really detail oriented while you do this. You don't want resin to drip down over the rest of your finished piece. It's going to be really hard to get off. If you wait until it's kind of halfway cured, you probably can kind of peel it off. Or you could go ahead and wipe it off while it's still liquid. That'll work. If you wait until it cures all the way, it's going to probably be impossible to actually get off. So you finish that, you let it cure again, the full curing period, and then ta-da! Here's your finished jewelry. Congratulations.